In week 12, we will finish our discussion and analysis of an interesting text from 1907 documenting a peculiar long-distance race from Beijing, China to Paris, France. on Thursday, on Thursday, we will complete our viewing of the movie Le Mans, which for sure will be on the short list for the final exam that I'll provide next week. And next week we'll have the last text, Motor Maids Across the Continent, a young adult novel with a group of teenage female students from a Connecticut high school in a posh area, West Haven. And this group, during their vacation at the end of the school year, are driving from Chicago to San Francisco, accompanied just by an older cousin who's acting as a chaperone for the four teenagers. With their cars, they'll have incredible adventures. They'll see places they would never see otherwise, meet interesting characters, develop sparks of romance, and we'll examine what that kind of literature would do for female readers of the period and how the technology spoke to the theme of women's rights, emancipation, women's independence and autonomy in a society still dominated by patriarchy. When we talk about patriarchy today, we forget how the conditions were different 100 or more years ago. As promised, today I will only spend half or less of the lecture talking about Barzini's text. I have a series of quotes and some images, so that in the second half of the class, we can engage in a class activity that will be useful for the understanding of the procedure and the criteria for the final exam, where small groups will go online, look for short stories on the automobile that could be included in the final project, and either today or Thursday we can comment on the findings, discuss how suitable whatever you found is for the project, because of course there are optimal examples that one can find and other stories where the inclusion of the automobile is at best marginal or tangential. Okay? This is the presentation that you find linked under week 12, where you'll find the excerpts and some of the images that we'll look at today. In the edition, in my own hardcover first edition of Barzini's text, whose title was translated and abbreviated as Pekin to Paris, there is a large map included and folded, placed in a pocket in the back cover, in the inside back cover. And here I took a picture, I put it on my table. It's a long map. I took a picture of the first section of it, so you can see how this map, this is from the Italian version, of course I have the Italian version, shows the departure point of Beijing, has flags for various stops, short texts indicating the name of the place and the date they reached that place, other numbers in red in here, 10, 11, 12, 13, also get captioned in here so that you have episodes. For example, number 8 is Mongolian Nights. And also still under number 8, because it's part of the same sequence in the narrative, Camel Caravans, right? So episodes from the narrative are highlighted here, yet at the same time you get the sense that this detailed map with bodies of water, with mountains and mountain passes, in some ways resemble an actual map, something that you might imagine could serve you as guide to undertake such a trip. And in order to place the narrative of this long distance race or journey, if you will, in a larger social and historical context, and gauge what the perception might have been for readers of the time, I've brought a different kind of map that I got from Wikipedia as one of the images illustrating the 1904-1905 war between Russia, which was still an empire under the Tsar, and Japan, which was expanding its reach, conquering territories already in Korea and Manchuria, China, not too far from the borders of Russian controlled the Russian controlled region of Siberia. And the reason I'm putting this map on the screen is for you to appreciate what it meant to cover large distances during a strategic operation. In preparation for the conflict, Russia moved groups of ships belonging to its fleet from the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. The bulk of the Russian fleet, with most of its battleship altogether, there were 11 battleships in this naval army, is the one following the blue itinerary. You can see that they stopped only at a few ports in northern Africa, probably Tangiers, in here, and in what today would be, I guess, Namibia or Tanzania. I would have to check. What's important to notice, and other ships crossed the Suez Canal and joined to form just one convoy in the Indian Ocean. When you look at the dates, you see that the bulk of the fleet left in October 15th, 1904. They reached the streets of Tsushima, where the actual battle took place. They were trying to sneak through under the cover of darkness during the night, when they were spotted by a Japanese cruiser who alerted the rest of the fleet once they made a positive identification, and the battle developed into the morning. The Russian fleet was annihilated. All of the 11 battleships were sunk or captured, and it was a defeat. But the point is that it took them from October 1904 until May 1905 to go from Europe to Japan with a strategic military fleet. They stopped at few ports along the way because, for the most part, they were refueling. There was the these warships were steamships. They had steam engines, so they needed coal. And they had 60 commercial vessels from a German company providing fresh supplies of coal along the way in the middle of the sea. That's where they refueled. So when you compared what you just saw to the itinerary followed by the Itala just in 60 days, all the way from Paris to Beijing, you get the sense that speed will be also a factor in the operations and the movements of supplies and military units in the future. So even though Barzini's book stays well away from any suggestion that this kind of long distance race proves also that military vehicles on wheels can reach China and engage in battles on any kind of Asian front, the idea was certainly planted in the minds of the readers. In fact, to put everything in context, I also included a different kind of documentary evidence of all kinds of magazines from the period in Italy. You would never imagine that Ars and Labor, a magazine edited by the company of Giulio Ricordi, which was the company that provided music sheets to the Metropolitan when Giacomo Puccini's opera would be staged, right? Imagine La Bohème or Madame Butterfly, which takes place in Japan, in fact. In this magazine, from July 1907, it starts with an article on Casanova, right? The 18th century Latin lover and writer. But in this kind of magazine, even in such a cultural kind of publication, you find a long article, which is part of a series entitled Armi e scene della guerra dell'avvenire, Weapons and Sceneries of the War of the Future, by none other than Mario Morasso, which I presented briefly. I showed the cover of a 1907 book by him about the new mechanical aspect of the world. And the topic of this article, which is contemporary to the events of the long distance race narrated in Barzini's book and precedes his book by several months. In this chapter, the topic is the mechanical warrior. Translated literally, I could better render the phrase as the mechanized warrior, and proceeds to explain in great details for the readers of this music and culture magazine, how the soldier of the future will not travel on foot, will be found inside an armored vehicle with a small turret and a cannon. This is the kind of strategic weapon that, in the imagination of the intellectuals and the politicians of the period, would be deployed across a variety of front lines and would be able to travel even in the absence of proper roads, would be able to be mobilized and reach distant targets in a short period of time. So keep in mind this parallel. Distance, the shortening of the distance between moving on an armored vehicle on wheels and moving on a ship, and the parallel between the strategic weight of the traditional ships for battle, the warships on reigning supreme in this category, and the ability of the armored vehicles of the future to also move artillery across distant lines. So keep that in mind while we're looking quickly at passages from the book by Barzini. This is the introduction, the very first page of the introduction, which allegedly was written by Prince Borghese, the owner and driver of the Itala car that won the race. But based on the style, we can surmise that it was in fact Barzini who wrote the introduction and put his name as a homage, put the prince's name underneath that. And the beginning is paradoxical and ironic. They ask, they come out flatly admitting that there were limitations to what they did. And if you remember, we know that for long distances past Beijing and before northern China, the car had to be pulled by Chinese porters across mountain passes or narrow and treacherous roads. And the car itself was partially disassembled to make it lighter and allow for that kind of human transportation. So they're saying in the introduction, there are people who say that our journey has proved one thing above others, namely, it is impossible to go by motor car from Pekin to Paris. So they're echoing potential criticism of their journey, of the mission they accomplished. And they're saying the paradox is a literally accurate statement of fact, meaning in the present year of grace, it is impossible to go by motor car alone. But this applies to a stretch of the journey, something like 2% of the journey. The car was still able to travel through Asia, Siberia, and Eastern Russia, Eastern Europe, etc. Then they conclude this passage, this concept, with an indirect reference to commerce, right? If we had vehicles able to travel from Paris, France to Beijing, China, would this be commercially, economically advantageous, right? So the insinuation is there, but it's immediately taken off the table to be re-examined later. Again, they're going very carefully about these suggestions because of the implications, military and otherwise strategic. And then they're dismissing the usefulness altogether of having commercial vehicles along this route by saying, well, it's impossible to transport Chinese artists from Beijing to Paris, which is an ironic way of implying that, after all, there are no products of great value to be brought, to be taken on commercial vehicles from China all the way to Europe. Of course, this is not true. And if anything, the first thing that should be mentioned is the stupendous amount of black tea that traveled from Beijing into Russia and the rest of Europe, among other viable and profitable products. But this is part of a skewed view of the East and the West, where the West is seen as the incarnation of modern progress, and the East Asia is seen as a backwards region that has not embraced industrialization and the infrastructural elements of modern economy. You'll see what I mean from later passages. The first chapter in the book is also interesting because in there we just have a page here, we find Barzini at home studying, because that's his idea of what a journalist's day should be. He's studying books about railroad networks in North America, because he is that kind of technical journalist that has to be educated in order to inform the readers, including administrators, high-ranking officers of the government, of the developments happening in key areas of social development, social and economic development, infrastructural development. He receives a phone call. Of course, we have the phone as a new device which is associated with speed, the speed of communication. He's summoned via phone by Albertini, the director of his newspaper, Corriere della Sera, gets on a taxi cab, goes to the newspaper, talks to Albertini, who shows him the article of Le Matin inviting people to register for this race, initially conceived as a race from Paris to China and not vice versa. And when after the director has measured Barzini's interest in covering this, the director says, "When can you leave?" And within a couple of days, Barzini is on a ship. The race itself will not happen until a few months later. However, Barzini is traveling by train and then by ship to reach North America. He'll come to New York. He'll cover a famous trial from 1907, White, the architect, involving famous people. Will travel by train all the way to San Francisco to examine the rebuilding of the city of San Francisco after the recent earthquake. Will take a ship to Japan, and then finally he'll arrive in China to find Prince Borghese already there, going out of Beijing on horse to map his journey, the route he should take when driving the car after the beginning of the race. That is to say, you find from the very first chapter, even before the Itala car comes to the page, you find two aspects that are both part of this idea of modern mobility. You find that speed of communication, moving quickly from a place such as Milan to New York, San Francisco, Japan, is an intrinsic part of the profession, the job of a foreign correspondent. And you find a new globalized world. The idea that all these places, no matter how far, New York, San Francisco, Japan, China, are interconnected. In terms of the skewed contrast between the East and the West, speed plays a part in here too, right? He's contemplating the two extremes of the journey, Paris versus Beijing. Our departure, that's Beijing, from the mysterious, of course, China was still an exotic place at the time, represented as such, mysterious capital of an incomprehensible empire, where incomprehensible simply means that it's not structured in the same way that Western countries are, the sound of whose life reaches us dimmed by a distance of space and thought. China is distant geographically and intellectually. Our arrival, this is Paris, at the most delicate instrument of resonance, Paris, where the slightest breath of life spreads over the world, increased and multiplied by 1,000 echoes. Where we have this idea that the global interconnections profit by the speed of the new devices, the phone, the telegraph, by the speed afforded by the new vehicles to amplify their power and their strategic relevance. To feel Pekin around you, this is a later passage, is like feeling yourself launch backwards, right, through time. Right? The idea that China has not embraced progress yet, to some remote, again, the idea of distance, immutable, and progress is instead Western progress identified with change, with constant change, immutable form of life, fixed long ages ago. One thing alone moves now in China, and that is time. And then all you have here are elements that suggest the opposite of speed, a dim languor, which in time envelops and wins you, makes you still, right? It mingles perchance with the dust. Dust is also material evidence of lack of change, right? Of the permanence of the past, the dust of so many old things, and is breathed in through the nostrils with a soothing forgetfulness of space and time. However, in other places in Asia, progress is felt in different ways. This is already from Siberia, from the large city of Omsk. So they can proceed at the highest possible speed. And right after this notation, we found a remark about progress to emphasize the connection between speed and progress. Here, in this remote place in Siberia, still far from Western Europe, but here we found ourselves also in an atmosphere of unexpected and wonderful activity and progress. So already you have a measurable change compared to China, to the description, the representation of China. In places, various places in Siberia, Barzini, the prince, and Ettore Guizzardi are invited in the rich houses of the upper bourgeoisie, the upper class of Russian society. And there they have conversations where people seem to grasp how important an automobile like the Itala, driven by Prince Borghese, is, and how that could benefit both transportation of humans and transportation of supplies. So there is this open mind that is able to embrace the elements of modern progress. Here they recount the time they gave a ride to a merchant from Irkutsk. This is Mr. Radionov. And what's interesting about this passage is the language of biology that is infused in the passage to describe the effect of speed. Words such as, biological words such as intoxication, mad, right? Mad as in maddening, for the flight, meaning the ride at high speed. The pine air filling the lungs, right? So the absorption of the experience in a physical way. The fact that the passenger now harbors the germ, right? Like a bacteria, the germ of the motor car passion. The idea that the possibilities of the motor car are endless is a diplomatic, discreet reference to both commercial use of vehicles and possibly military usage of such vehicles, of heavy vehicles as heavy as the Itala, right? And more people who had interesting questions. in this passage, Barzini is explaining how relevant their journey from Beijing to Paris was, because it was a convincing test of the reliability and the powers of the automobile. As I mentioned several times, between 1907 and 1908, the car was about to be produced in larger numbers, purchased not only by the wealthiest segment of the population in Western countries, in Europe and in the US, but also made available to the upper middle class, right? The civilized world, again, this skewed, globalized view of the world to be dominated by the civilized, more progressed countries, it's a colonialist view, was witnesses the amplest, completest, most persuasive testing of this instrument, right? And this abolition, what is the goal? The goal is the abolition of all human or animal traction, right? To replace human strength, such as in the case of porters, or think of the people who were pulling barges on canals all over Europe, and especially in Russia, to replace all of that with internal combustion engine. This abolition is one of the surest indices of social progress, meaning a mechanized society is indeed a society on its way to a future of progress. And this is kind of a manifesto praising the automobile as the protagonist of the book, and how the book itself was intended to show what a car such as that can do. The description of all the way the car moves and all the vibration, the creaks, the mechanical effects of traveling at speed on difficult roads and difficult terrains, all those details make the automobile come alive in the pages of Barzini, and also in his mind fulfill his own professional mission of educating the reader about the capacities of this new technology. Finally, I've included a few passages, but you find more in the presentation, about Ettore Guizzardi, the mechanician on board and driver of the car, as the prototype for a new kind of humanity. And here you find it expressed through his body language, right? Ettore doesn't have to talk about the automobile to prove his competency. After 14, 16, 18 hours of travel, so of course, they're not often traveling at high speed, so they try to maximize the time they spend driving, during which, with clenched teeth and tense nerves, this is Ettore, had listened for the slightest sound of the engine, the slightest creaking of the car. He's trying to gauge if the car is operating safely, correctly, that he's trying to avoid any major breakdown. Fighting for its own very existence against the difficulty of the ground, Ettore, at the end of the day, this new mechanical man, would spend 2 or 3 hours working under the frame, under the chassis of the car, in the air heated by the tired engine, right? The engine is still hot, dense with the smell of the lubricating oil. Of course, ancient engines drip more oil, leak more oil. Examining, he goes through all the range of practices by Ettore, examining, testing, registering, tightening. Registering here would be calibrating, right, various parts. The nuts which had slackened, the screws which had moved. And let me continue with a similar passage. The first time that I saw him, this is Barzini talking about Ettore, he was lying on his back under the Itala, motionless, with folded arms, meaning it's clear from the description that he's not working on the car, it's just contemplating the car. I thought for a moment that he was working, but no, he was at play. And later I found that that is one of his favorite postures, a way he has of taking recreation. This confirms the idea of a new dimension for human existence, the symbiosis, the symbiotic relationship with the car, right? His recreation is still found in proximity of the car. He is one with the car, whether he's riding on the car or working on the car or just lying under the car, just looking at it. When he has nothing special on hand, he stretches himself out under his motor car and contemplates it piece by piece, bolt by bolt, screw by screw, in long, strange colloquy with his machine. And here I suggest a peculiar parallel, because as a humanist, when I read this passage, my mind goes immediately to a famous description of Leonardo da Vinci contained in the first book of art history, the first chronological book of art history going from Giotto to Michelangelo, written by Giorgio Vasari and published in the second half of the 16th century. Because in that book, in the chapter devoted to Leonardo da Vinci, Vasari, the art historian, gives us this insightful anecdote, whereby Leonardo is in Milan working on the Last Supper, which was later considered the greatest fresco in Renaissance art. Stay away from any such hierarchy. It's meaningless to point out what is best. In any case, in the anecdote, Leonardo, who's working within a convent, is found by the head of the convent, by the abbot. The abbot finds Leonardo motionless, not using his hand, folded arms, contemplating the wall before he paints it. Because, of course, the fresco would be painted at segments, right? The plaster would be laid, a layer of fresh plaster would be laid until it was dry enough and moist enough to absorb the colors, and then the painter would proceed. And keep in mind that artists during that period are not paid by item, right? One fresco, a certain amount of money. They're paying through the time they spend working on this. So if Leonardo spends 6 months, 12, 18 months, the abbot will have to pay him more handsomely, right? So the abbot complains with Leonardo, criticizing Leonardo for being lazy, essentially. And he goes all the way to the Duke of Milan, who was a patron, a political patron for Leonardo. And Leonardo's response is that a modern artist is working primarily with his mind. That even when he is just standing in front of a wall with his arms folded, without a brush in his hand, he's still working on his work of art. So, from this point of view, Guicciardi is very much the new Renaissance man. whose competency is born out of his own tight, close relationship with the car, where he spends time working, but also in contemplation. There are many other passages included in this presentation that I don't have time. For example, in here, what's important is the fact that Ettore is seen not just as a mechanic, somebody who's able to work on the car. He's seen as a creator, as a lower level engineer with a creative mind. Because mechanical technologies, in Barzini's view of the modern world, are evolving at all times. So you cannot just be trained, be the passive recipient of technological knowledge. You have to develop a knack for these technologies as well. Of course, he tells the story of how the prince and Barzini came together when the locomotive engine controlled by Ettore's father derailed and his father died. And this is one of several profiles of Ettore as the new members of modern society, as someone from the lower classes with upper mobility, with the ability to move through the social ladder. In him, there is nothing servile, meaning there is leadership, there is initiative in him. He has an absolute assurance of his merit, which means modern societies, and this will be very true of fascist Italy later on, that insisted a lot on merit. Western societies are embracing progress through the assignment of merit, to the acknowledgement of merit, rather. Meritocracy is one sure way to foster change in society, right? So he knows that he's deserving of recognition, a keen sense of his own responsibilities. He's not an anarchist, doesn't bring entropy to society. He knows he has duties to fulfill. And he gives his intelligent service, meaning it's not just submissive to orders, for example, the orders of the prince, the owner of the car, but he is intelligent, meaning that he needs to apply intelligence to his role. So he has an area of independence. He has discretion within his job, his role. And with the disinterestedness and the loyalty of a friend to one who has been able to inspire him with trust. Of course, he's loyal to the prince, but this idea of being disinterested and loyal is carried over to the idea that in order to have societies progress in the right way, people have to embrace progress as a value they're committed to beyond any form of retribution. Right? And of course, the prince has inspired him, and etc., etc. Let me see what else deserves to be mentioned. No, that's it. Okay, so we have at least 30 minutes for the next part of our class. Let me jump out of the presentation and explain what we're about to do, and if necessary, we'll continue on Thursday before the film. With your computer or your phone, your tablet, go to the wiki of the class, and from the portal or other segments, you can go to the Go-To section, find there the format and methodology of the final project, and in here, in the table of contents, you'll find the context of the research with all the sources allowed for the project, and you find a series of links to different magazines from that era and different years. But you can go beyond I would not suggest you go lower, because the lower you go in the 1900s, if you go to 1903, 1902, you'll find fewer short stories about the car. If anything, you should go higher, 1910, 11, 12, to find more short stories. So using these links in groups of 2 or 3 with your electronic devices, go see these journals, use keywords to find short stories. Keep in mind, it's not easy to find them. It requires patience. Within the group, you can divide the work as you see fit. You can all look at the same collection of issues, or you can go in different directions. By my own calculation, it easily takes an hour to find a suitable short story. So I don't expect every group to find one, but it's like going for white mushrooms in the Tuscan Apennines. Sometimes you can get lucky and find 2 of them in a single issue. The purpose of this activity is twofold: to show you the mechanical steps to find a short story for the project. For the project, you need 2 short stories. One you can borrow from the list you find in here, and another should be one you find yourself. The other thing is to assess together, at this point, most probably on Thursday, what makes a short story that you found suitable for the project. And I can tell you how good, on a scale from 1 to 5, any story you find would be for your project, from marginal to average to excellent find. Okay? Of course, the other advantage you have doing this in class is to invoke my help. I can move around, I can sit down with you, I can answer your questions. So work with at least another person, coordinate, decide where you want to look for stories, and then whenever you click in here, let me show you just an example. So let's say I go to Manzi, which is usually a good source. I go to, let's say, something later, 1910, 11, right? I can click and get to the full view of this collection of issues, right? I have 900 pages, there are multiple issues in here, and you can either click search on text, and in here put words such as automobile, motor car. Keep in mind that just the word car is the most ambiguous. Sometimes used for the new automobiles, more often used for train cars, street cars, trolleys. Sometimes just motor. And you have a list of keywords to use that are aligned with the language of the period in the page for the final project. So you can enter the keywords there. If you prefer, from here you can go to Google. If you click on get this item, then you can go to Google if you prefer to work on Google. And here too, you have a search box. And then with the results, especially if you see multiple results within a small group of pages, you can click go see if it is an article. No, we don't want articles, or a short story. If it is a short story where the automobile is just mentioned, or one where the automobile plays a central role.